Hello, my name is Brian Burnham. This is Module 9 for AEP 855, the case study, When Ethics and Policies Collide. Before I start, I do want to apologize ahead of time. I've still got words covered up by my picture screen right there. I'll do my best to move it around when necessary. I hate that it does that. I'm just not a very tech-savvy individual. All right, the facts. I'm not going to read this word for word, but you pause it and can read it yourself, but I do want to make sure I hit all the high points. Obviously, we have James, who is a big muscular bully who has had multiple run-ins with discipline, doesn't seem to care very much about his grades and or school. I do think it's important to note that he has made some progress with our next individual, Mr. Inman, who's a new first-year assistant principal. He's been focusing on trying to have deeper relationships with students like James. And then David, a much smaller boy than James, who is in honors classes, plays the trombone in the school band, and has never been in trouble. Over the course of the school year, as I stated, Mr. Inman has been trying to play basketball with some of these students after school, specifically James and his little crew that he runs around with. And they have made great progress with each other. Trust has been built, a deeper relationship has been fostered, and James has been showing improvements. He still has lapses in judgment and still does knucklehead things, obviously, and some of those we're going to talk about today. But progress is being made. James was witnessed passing something to David in the hallway by another teacher. The teacher thought maybe that it was drugs, so she reported it, not knowing exactly what was going on. It's her duty and her job to report that. Turns out James had given David some brass knuckles that he was going to use in a fight later after school, and that he threatened David to hold them or he was going to beat him up. So right there off the top, in my opinion, is a bullying situation. So I think that's the main thing we need to focus on as we start to look at what decisions were made. The SRO was brought in, and since there was possession of brass knuckles, which is considered a weapon by school board policy, the SRO has to arrest both of them. They will have felonies, quote unquote, on their juvenile records. They'll have to go to court. There'll be a minimum of 45 days in an alternative educational setting. And, this is a big deal for David because he's never been in trouble before. Mr. Inman, who took into consideration the fact that James, when pressed, admitted that he forced David to hold the brass knuckles and basically creating an alibi for David on why he had them in his possession, that he was only holding them because James threatened to beat him up, which is also progress for James that I think is notable because he's never a guy that has, or kid that has taken the rap or accepted responsibility for his actions. So David was ultimately not written up. The paperwork was not filed by Mr. Inman. And James was the only one that had to have the zero tolerance policy enforced. However, once the lead principal, the boss of the building, found out how the situation was handled, along with the special education director for the district, both of them requested Mr. Inman change his decision and file the paperwork so that David would be treated the same way James was. And if he didn't, then an official reprimand would be written up and placed in his permanent file. From the legal side of things, James and David were both indeed in possession of brass knuckles. There is a zero tolerance policy in place for expulsion if you have a weapon at school, a minimum of 45 days. All the policy is there. The law requires an arrest for a felony offense. The zero tolerance policy is created for types of situations like this to make them black and white for administration, and also to allow the same rules to be applied to everybody across the board. The ethical factors at play, however, are David has no prior discipline issues, and James had taken full responsibility, saying that he forced David to take the brass knuckles from him to quote unquote hold. He also showed remorse for his actions, which is a huge step for James and his progress in this area. And then David was a victim of bullying, being forced to hold the brass knuckles. He would have never had possession of them had James not walked up to him and threatened to beat him up if he didn't take them from him. His future is going to be severely affected with a felony charge on his juvenile record. He's already an honor student. He's in the band. Going into high school, he's probably going to be very involved with it, clubs and things like that. He will be an appealing college candidate a few years down the road, and then he becomes not appealing with a criminal record like this. I think it's important to note. If we stick just to the facts and you make a decision only on the legal side of things and the facts that are presented, and you keep it extremely black and white, I think that's borderline reckless. There's gray areas here that, in my opinion, cannot be denied or skipped. Mr. Emmett is trying very hard to advocate for James and David from an ethical point of view, but the zero tolerance policy is making that extremely difficult. You're forcing Mr. Emmett to go a direction he does not want to or feel comfortable going, even when you force him to think about a reprimand to make it right for all parties involved. It is our job as administrators and leaders to identify what is both legal and ethical and make the best decision for all. We should not be basing our decisions on one side or the other. In my opinion, every case is different and must be handled accordingly. Board policy is in place for a reason. I understand that. However, carte blanche interpretation runs the risk of severely damaging relationships, future endeavors of individuals, and consciences of all stakeholders. Everybody is aware that there are extenuating circumstances in this situation, with David and his family being failed by the school, the district, and all stakeholders in the position to educate and model ethical behavior for him, protect him, and always maintain the best interests. Synthesizing the facts, it's our job as educational leaders that we have to be able to reason through logic using facts and guide them in making decisions where both legal and ethical pressures are present. The people are listed there on the left. We have James, David, Mr. Emmett, the SRO, the fifth period teacher, James's mom, and David's mom. And also the place this is being discussed is, place in discussion is Rocket Junior High School, a school of 900 students. It's an urban location on the south side of town. My first thought was the south side of Chicago, but that's just because I hear south side Chicago all the time. That's probably why my head went there. And it's important to note that this is a public school program. That's important because school board policies that they're in potential violation of are zero tolerance policies, and they have ramifications. Also, we have studied in other courses that zero tolerance policies a lot of times are biased both racially and social economically. And I think we need to keep that in consideration. Why repeat the cycle if we can be logical and avoid that? The stakeholders we're speaking of here, we have the school district and the administration, includes the Board of Education and all of its policies, Mr. Emmett, who's the assistant principal, James and his mom, David and his mom, the school resource officer, all of the students in the district, and all of the parents in the district, and the teachers as well. James and David are the catalysts within this situation, but there are more stakeholders at play than just the two of them. There's a precedence that's being set here that will ultimately affect all students and parents in the district moving forward. Being given an ultimatum by a superior forces a line to be drawn in the sand of interpersonal relationships with Mr. Inman and building and district administration above him moving forward from this incident. After analyzing the facts we were given, nobody left this situation without being affected. All parties involved did not have a say in the process, and the school policy being in place and protocols needing to be followed. These are the instances when a hard, fast rule or a policy has a negative effect on everyone involved and potentially can cause a rift amongst members of the entire community. You can read both options here. I don't really have a great place to put this. I'll put it over option 1, take no further action. If you come in and take option 1, then you're looking at not doing anything based off of what we were given. So Mr. Inman would make the decision that he made, not change his paperwork, and make sure that David was not expelled for the incident. He's sticking with his decision based on his moral compass, his integrity, and his inner ethics. He wants to stand firm in what you believe, in what he believes in, which allows you as an individual to have others around you know where you stand. It leads to deeper relationships and ultimately trust, which is what he was building with James in the first place. As long as Mr. Emmons' actions are not a quote-unquote fireable offense, then I think this option is the one that he should choose. I've been in trouble before. As long as you're not getting fired, if you know what you're doing is right or you believe that it's right, to me, I think that justifies the decision. But again, it's easy for me to make these statements sitting behind a screen in a college course and not being a paid administrator to make these calls. And then option 2 would be to change his decision and adhere to board policy and listen to his superiors, change paperwork to reflect what the policy says, and David ultimately gets expelled as well. This decision leads down a path for teachers and parents and students viewing the current model and the system to be broken. David was a victim of bullying, and that fact was not acknowledged and is completely actually being glossed over and not even mentioned. Mr. Emmons runs the risk of being affected professionally moving forward as his moral compass has been neglected and he will be wrought with guilt. At least I would. That's just how I function. There are some options that could be taken. You can see those in the middle. I'm sure you've already read those as you're sitting here listening to me ramble. But that might help either side, depending on which direction you went. You could do these 4 things to help yourself or some of the other parties involved. Acknowledging to others that David was bullied, bring it to light, make sure people are aware. Appeal to the board about their decision towards David and the policy as it's currently written. Maybe things like this may not happen in the future. You could file a grievance if you do have a permanent record, a permanent file put in your record with your teachers union to protect your own personal file. And then also make sure that all parties are aware when the next board meeting is. If nothing else, they can come and question and challenge the decision. All right, evaluating the options. Logical assessment of an educational leader's options allows them to weigh both ethical and legal ramifications, evaluate their decisions, and model the decision-making process to demonstrate sound quality leadership. I've listed both the pros and the cons here. I'm not going to go through them. I've actually got to move on. I'm being pressed for time. This is my second time recording this, and I'm still pressed for time. The pros on option 1 for me is, the one that I would choose is that at the very least, even if records get changed, David's expulsion is postponed, takes longer, and his parents have an opportunity to organize and get their ducks in a row. The con, obviously, is you receive a reprimand in your file. And then the pros on the option 2 side, district policy is in place. It's very black and white. It allows the policy to be taken serious by teachers, parents, and students moving forward because they'll see that there is no wiggle room here. And then the cons is losing collateral that you've built up with the community as Mr. Emmons that he's been working so hard to get. As I said, the best option for me would have been option 1, taking no actions in terms of changing anything about the decision that was made, even after being contacted by the director of special education at the district level and informed of an official reprimand. If I'm allowed to have professionalism and professional integrity, that's important to me, and that's all I honestly care about. So that's why I would make this decision. The fact that David was a bully, was a victim of bullying, would be the first place that I would start, and I would bang that drum from the word go, and then we would figure everything else as we go. Implementing the decision, you can see my steps here. Pause it, and you can read number 1, and then 2, 3, 4, and 5. There's a lot of information here. I advise or I encourage you to pause it and read this. There's just a lot of steps that can be taken, and there's a lot of things that can be done to ease the blow on both sides. And then here's my reflection. I just think this was a great assignment. It forced us to really view ourselves and think about how we would handle the situation. So thank you for that, and I appreciate your attention.